over the last century, we've seen a really astonishing change in funerary behaviour in terms of how we dispose of dead bodies to begin with, and that it's such a massive change that I think that archaeologists of the future, if they don't have access to any of our historical records and all they have is the physical remains, will think that there was a huge religious transition in Britain in the 20th century, because we went from almost no cremations, less than 1% cremations in 1900, to, by the time we get to the year 2000, around 70% of dead bodies being cremated rather than buried, which had been the previous tradition. And that's the kind of shift that we might look at earlier in archaeology and say, well, this is either a different population coming in or it's a huge religious change. Now, of course, there have been religious changes in Britain over that time, and the main one is increasing secularization. But I think in some ways that trend towards increasing rate of cremation rather than burial, and the increasing secularization of our society are almost two separate things. And it's quite interesting. I think what's really driven that rise in cremation has been much more to do with, I suppose, mortuary needs rather than funerary demands. So, in other words, it's more about how we can physically dispose of so many dead bodies over time, rather than any kind of philosophical, spiritual, religious approach to the question. So I think it's amazing that, for instance, if you look at the archaeologist, famous archaeologist Pitt Rivers, when he dies in 1900 and he's buried on his estate in Cranbourne Chase, he is cremated. And it was a very, very unusual thing to have done at the time. I think perhaps some of the reasons, he doesn't tell us why, he didn't write about why he chose to have his body cremated. We know that his wife was very unhappy about it. But I think that some of the reason for that choice, that unusual choice at the time, might have been because he'd spent so long looking at different funerary traditions over time, so that for him, he'd kind of broken away from the bounds of thinking that, there is a normal way of doing things. And in fact, we could be much more flexible, much more versatile, and make much more personal choices. So yeah, that's the big change that I see over the last 100 years.
Interesting. Louise, same question to you. How do you see things changing, particularly in the profession itself? But however you want to answer the question, of course.
I'll talk about the last couple of years and the changes that I have seen. So I call myself a progressive funeral director, and some people really hate that term. But generally that just means that the work that we do is not fitting into boxes like some of the more conventional funeral directors, where everything is quite packaged and sort of fits around their needs rather than the family. So everything becomes very bespoke. But the other thing that really defines us is the level of engagement that we offer to people, if they want to be engaged and they want to participate in the funeral. So whether that's coming into the mortuary itself to have a look round and see where the person will be kept, or it's being involved in the mortuary care, so washing and dressing the person, being very hands-on with that process and asking lots of questions about it and being very real about what it's like after someone has died, to seeing the experience of being with the person as something that's actually really important and needs to be done better, not in a sort of depressing box room in a high street unit, where you can stay for sort of 20 minutes and there's religious paraphernalia everywhere and some really ugly decoration from the 80s, that kind of thing, but turning it into a whole experience where people can have quite profound and meaningful experiences of being with the dead person before the funeral actually takes place. And we have, Poetic Endings is set up to facilitate all of this happening. And the fact that we exist, I think, says that it is happening and that we've helped so many people have these kind of experiences. Shows how people are beginning to challenge their ideas about death and take emotional risks and come and want to spend time with the dead person and not be afraid of it because they see it as important. Now then COVID came along and threw a spanner into the works because it's made everything I've just talked about very difficult to facilitate, because even if the person who has died potentially with COVID, the risk that they pose can be contained, the main issue has been the risk that the living present in facilitating the kind of experiences I'm talking about.